The cattle were dying, and Fletcher Jarvis was on his knees in the mud. She had never seen him on his knees before. Not in 6 weeks of working his ranch, not through the drought that had baked the creek beds to pale dust, not through the legal threats that had arrived on official paper stamped with the county seal. Fletcher Jarvis did not kneel. He stood at 6 feet 2 inches of sun-hardened sinew and Colorado stubbornness, and the whole county of Larimer knew it. But here, in the far east pasture, with the rain coming down in gray curtains and 3 of his best breeding stock lying motionless in the glistening black mud, he was on his knees. Fiona Pruett stood 20 feet back, frozen beside the fence post she had grabbed for balance when her boots hit the slick earth. She had run out here because she had heard him shouting from the barn, a sound so raw and unlike him that her heart had seized in her chest. She had thought someone was hurt. Someone was, just not in any way she could bandage. He had both hands pressed flat against the flank of the largest heifer, a magnificent roan he called Daisy with what he probably thought was dry, practical irony. The animal was gone. The stillness of her was absolute in the way that only death can be absolute, a permanent and total quiet that the living cannot manufacture. Fletcher's hands moved in small circles on the animal's side, the gesture of a man who knew full well there was nothing to be done and could not stop doing it anyway. His shoulders shook once. Then again, Fiona's breath caught in her throat like a hook through silk. She pressed her lips together so hard her teeth cut the inside of her mouth, and she tasted copper, and she did not make a single sound. The rain fell around him in silver threads. His hat was off, hanging somewhere in the grass, and the water ran down through his dark hair and traced the sharp angle of his jaw and fell from his chin. And Fletcher Jarvis, the most closeted, iron-spined, emotionally fortified man she had ever encountered in 24 years of living, pressed his forehead against the dead animal's neck, and he wept. Not dramatically, not with heaving sobs or any of the theatrical grief she might have read about in the dime novels she kept hidden under her cot. Quietly. The way a man weeps who has never allowed himself the practice and does not know how to make it small. It lasted perhaps 30 seconds. Then he straightened. He scrubbed both palms over his face, hard and efficient the way you wipe mud from a knife blade. He reached for his hat, settled it back on his head, and pushed himself to his feet. His jaw was set. His eyes, when he turned and finally registered that she was standing there, were unreadable as always. "How long have you been standing there?" he said. It was not quite a question. "Just arrived," Fiona said. "I came to tell you supper is ready." She turned and walked back toward the house, and she did not look back. And every step she took across that muddy field, she carried something new inside her chest, something heavy and bright and terrifying in equal measure. She had come to work at the Jarvis Ranch in the autumn of 1882 under circumstances that were, to use the most charitable possible framing, complicated. The town of Caldera Creek, Colorado, sat in a valley between 2 ridgelines of the Rocky Mountain foothills. Population 412 souls according to the last census, which everyone agreed had undercounted at least by half. It was the kind of town that had sprung up around a cattle trail and then survived the trail's rerouting by sheer collective stubbornness. A scattering of weatherboard buildings along a single main street, a decent livery, a general store run by a woman named Harriet Combs, who knew everyone's secrets and dispensed them with selective generosity, and a church whose congregation had not agreed on anything since 1879. Fiona had arrived from Denver on the stage in October, carrying a carpet bag, a sewing box, a letter of reference from a household in the city where she had worked as a cook for 3 years, and a secret she was not yet prepared to share with anyone. She was 24, She was alone. She was, in the technical language of the territory, a woman without a male protector, which meant that every man in Caldera Creek felt entitled to have an opinion about her arrangements. She had answered Fletcher Jarvis's advertisement in the Larimer County Gazette for a housekeeper and cook, positioned to start immediately, competitive wage, no references from Denver required. That last phrase had caught her eye like a fishhook. She had learned, upon arriving at the ranch, that the advertisement had been placed somewhat against Fletcher's will by his foreman, a compact and cheerful Mexican man named Rodrigo Vega, who had apparently decided that his employer's meals needed professional supervision. Fletcher himself had greeted her at the door with an expression that could most kindly be described as barely contained displeasure. "I said I didn't need someone," he had said, which she would later understand was his version of hello. "Your advertisement says otherwise," she had replied. He had looked at her for a long moment with those unsettling gray eyes, then stepped aside to let her in, which she had also learned to interpret as his version of welcome. That was 6 weeks before the rainy night in the east pasture. In those 6 weeks, she had assembled, piece by piece, a portrait of Fletcher Jarvis from the fragments he allowed to fall in her direction, not through any conversation he voluntarily initiated, but through observation, through the things Rodrigo told her during morning coffee, through the evidence of the ranch itself, and through the occasional inadvertent revelation that slipped past his defenses in moments of practical necessity. He was 32 years old. He had built the Jarvis Ranch from raw land 8 years ago with money inherited from a father he did not speak of except once, when he said the man had been useful for exactly one thing, and that was dying at the right time and leaving a bank draft. He worked harder than any 2 men she had ever met, and he worked in a manner that suggested he was either punishing himself for something or trying to outrun it. He had no family that anyone in Caldera Creek knew of. He did not drink at the saloon. He did not attend church. He rode the boundaries of his land every single morning before dawn, and Rodrigo had told her that this had been his practice for all 8 years, through blizzard and heat wave and everything between, because Fletcher Jarvis did not trust fences and did not trust other people to see what he needed to see. He was also, without question, the most quietly beautiful man she had ever found herself in proximity to, which she considered both irrelevant and deeply inconvenient. The morning after the cattle died, he was already gone when she came down to start breakfast at 5:30. She could hear him in the barn, the rhythmic sound of work that had no particular urgency but was being done as though it did. She built the fire in the stove, put water on, sliced bacon, mixed cornbread batter, and set a pot of coffee going. And when he came in at 6:30, his boots left mud on the floor she had swept the night before, and she said nothing about it. He sat at the head of the table, which was his customary place, and she set his plate in front of him and poured his coffee, and they occupied the same kitchen in their customary silence. Rodrigo came in a few minutes later with 2 of the other ranch hands, a young man named Lee Church, who was 20 and perpetually earnest, and an older man named Cal Duffer, who had worked cattle ranches across 3 territories and offered unsolicited wisdom on most subjects. "Lost 3 head," Cal said, settling into his chair with the gravity of a man pronouncing a verdict. "Heard it was the lung sickness." "It was the lung sickness," Fletcher said. "That'll spread," Cal said. "I know what it does. You'll want to separate the—" "I know what I'll want to do, Cal." This was the particular dialect of masculine communication that Fiona had been translating for 6 weeks, and she had become reasonably fluent. What this exchange meant was that Fletcher had already been out at dawn separating the herd and had probably done it before any of them were awake, and he did not require the assistance of anyone's stated concern, though he also was not unaware that it came from a place of genuine care, which he found uncomfortable enough that he needed to shut it down quickly. What she did not know yet was what the loss of those cattle meant in real terms. She learned this gradually over the following days through the accumulated evidence of Fletcher's movements and the conversations she was not meant to overhear. The lung sickness took 4 more animals over the following week. 7 cattle dead was a number that would have been painful but manageable in a good year. This was not a good year. The drought that had started in July had been severe enough to thin the herd's condition before autumn, and the late rains that finally came had come with the damp cold that encouraged exactly the kind of sickness that was now moving through the Jarvis cattle like a slow and deliberate disaster. Beyond the cattle, there was the matter of Clement Hatch. Fiona had heard the name first from Harriet Combs at the general store, where she went twice a month for supplies. Harriet had the kind of voice that was perpetually poised on the edge of confidence, and she had pulled Fiona close over the bolt of winter flannel and said in a tone that was not quite a whisper, "You're working for Fletcher Jarvis. You know about Clement Hatch." Fiona had said she did not. Harriet had told her. Clement Hatch was the largest landowner in Larimer County, a man of 52 who had arrived in the territory a decade ago with capital from an Eastern banking family, and a philosophy that Harriet summarized as, "What he doesn't own yet is simply a matter of time and pressure." He had already absorbed 4 neighboring ranches, all of them acquired under circumstances that the previous owners had described, in terms ranging from embittered to terrified, as not exactly voluntary. The methods Hatch used were legal in the way that many things in 1882 Colorado were legal, which was to say that legality and justice had been imperfectly introduced to each other and were not yet on speaking terms. Fletcher Jarvis's ranch sat on land that Hatch wanted badly. It was land that controlled water access from one of the few reliable creek tributaries in the valley. Whoever held that land in a dry year held a significant portion of the county's cattle ranching future. Hatch had made an offer twice. Fletcher had declined twice. Harriet said there was some in town who believed the third encounter would not take the form of an offer. When Fiona got back to the ranch that afternoon with the supply wagon, she unloaded flour and salt and cornmeal and dried beans, and she thought about what she had learned, and she thought about the man sitting in the far room at the desk going over his ledger books with an expression she now recognized as controlled dread. She had not told him her secret yet. She was not ready to lose the job. Her secret was this. She had fled Denver not because the household there had let her go, but because the son of the household, a man named Gerald Whitmore who was 35 and married, and believed that his family's money entitled him to whatever he decided he wanted, had been making the kind of advances that began as uncomfortable and were escalating toward dangerous. She had given 3 weeks' notice, obtained a reference from the household matriarch who knew nothing of this, packed her carpetbag, and gotten on the stage before Gerald Whitmore realized she was gone. The city was not safe for a woman alone who had made an enemy of a wealthy man's bruised pride, and she did not yet know if the distance she had put between herself and Denver was sufficient. She was not being chased, as far as she knew. But she had not stopped checking faces in town for familiar features. What she had not expected, when she took a housekeeping position in a remote valley ranch as a means of disappearing quietly for a season, was to find herself increasingly, helplessly, completely preoccupied with the man who owned it. This was inconvenient for several reasons. The most immediate was professional. The second most immediate was personal dignity. The third, which she examined in the quiet of her small room behind the kitchen in the evenings before she slept, was that Fletcher Jarvis was so thoroughly and completely armored against any such possibility that caring about him felt like pressing one's hands against a stone wall and hoping for warmth. He was not unkind to her. This was important to understand. He was not the cold, dismissive employer who made his disdain a daily weather system in the house. He said please and thank you at meals always, with the faintly formal precision of a man who had been taught manners by someone who considered them moral obligations rather than social lubricant. He brought firewood in without being asked on cold mornings. When she had spent an entire afternoon making a pie from dried apples, he had eaten 2 slices and said, with what she had come to recognize as his version of effusive praise, "That's good." When she had been ill for 2 days in November, he had left a cup of broth outside her door each morning without comment and without requiring acknowledgement. But he did not speak to her beyond what was necessary. He did not ask about her history. He did not seem particularly curious about her as a person, though she sometimes caught him watching her with an expression she could not decode, and when she met his eyes, he always looked away first. He was in the barn when the rider came. She was the one who answered the knock at the front door, and found a young man in a town suit, who introduced himself as a representative of the office of County Commissioner Doyle, and who presented her with a formal legal document sealed with the county seal. She accepted it because there was no one else to accept it, and she stood at the door in the cold air and looked at it for a moment. And even from her limited knowledge of legal language, she could understand that it was not good. When Fletcher came in, she was standing at the kitchen table holding the document. He looked at her. He looked at the document. Something moved behind his eyes. "What is it?" he said. She held it out. "A man from the county commissioner's office. They're claiming a water rights dispute on the eastern tributary. There's a hearing scheduled for January 7th. He took the document from her. He read it in a silence that had a different quality than his usual silence, a tightly wound quality, the silence of a man who is working very hard to contain something that wants very badly to be loud. "Hatch," he said finally, "just the name. A complete sentence." "Is there a lawyer in town?" she asked. "There's a lawyer," he said. "He works for Hatch." He set the document on the table and walked back out to the barn. She stood at the kitchen window and watched him go, and she thought about secrets, and about how the world had a way of arranging its cruelties to arrive in multiples. Over the following 2 weeks, the ranch operated under the kind of siege mentality that Fletcher wore like a second skin, without appearing to notice it was there. He drove himself and his hands with a relentless focus, working to secure the surviving cattle, shore up the fence lines, manage what resources remained. He rode to Caldera Creek twice to speak with anyone who might have legal knowledge or political standing, and he came back both times with the set expression of a man who has been told no in different ways by different mouths. Rodrigo told Fiona quietly, over coffee one morning while Fletcher was out riding the boundaries in the pre-dawn dark, that Hatch had been working this particular strategy for months. "He is trying to bleed the man until he falls," Rodrigo said, with a flat disgust that required no additional commentary. "Is there any way to challenge the document?" Fiona asked. "You would need someone who could find the original transaction records, from before Fletcher bought the land." "Where would those be?" Rodrigo looked at her. "Denver, the Territorial Land Office, Denver." She sat with that word for a moment, feeling its particular weight. "I know Denver," she said carefully. She did not tell Rodrigo why. But she spent that evening in her room thinking about what she knew, about who she had known in the city, about the women she had worked alongside in the Whitmore household, and what connections they might have or know of, about the cost of the stage fare and back, and whether she could find what was needed in time. She had not decided anything when she went to sleep, but the thinking had started, and she had found in her experience that once certain kinds of thinking started, they tended to arrive somewhere. The next morning at breakfast, Fletcher arrived later than usual, which was unusual enough that she looked at him twice before she could stop herself. He sat down and accepted coffee and sat with both hands around the cup, which he did not normally do. 3 of the separated cattle are showing symptoms, he said, not to anyone in particular, not quite to her. She set a plate in front of him. "I'm sorry," she said. He looked up at her with a directness that was startling after weeks of deliberately averted gazes, and she held very still. "How much do you know about the situation with Hatch?" he said. It was the most direct question he had ever asked her about something that was not immediate and practical, and she answered it honestly. "More than you probably intended me to know. Small towns talk, and I go to the general store." He considered this for a moment, seemed to find it reasonable rather than offensive, and looked back at his coffee. "The hearing is in 3 weeks. I know. I don't have a way to fight it." She sat down across from him, which she had not done before. She always ate standing at the counter or after the hands had finished. He looked at this development with mild surprise, but did not object. "I may be able to get to Denver and find the original transaction records," she said. "The ones that would undermine the validity of Hatch's document." He was quiet for long enough that she began to think he was going to refuse the subject entirely. "Why would you do that?" he said. "Because I have watched you grieve cattle in the rain and not asked anyone for help and worked yourself toward collapse to save something you built with your own hands," she thought. "Because it seems solvable," she said. "And Harriet Combs knows a man in Denver who worked the territorial land office before he retired, and she thinks he can point me to the right records. It would take a week, maybe 10 days. I have reason to go to Denver." She paused. "I have an errand there I've been putting off." He looked at her again with that searching quality, the look that felt like he was trying to read a language he did not quite know. "You'd miss 3 pay periods," he said. "I'm aware. I can't pay you for time you're not here. I'm aware of that too." Another silence, longer and different in texture. "What errand?" he said. "A personal one." She watched him decide not to press it. This was one of the things she had come to find unexpectedly appealing about him. He applied the same principle of privacy to others that he required for himself. He did not dig at things that were not offered. "The stage runs Thursday," he said. "I know. Take what you need from the household account for the fare." He said it quickly, in the tone of a man who makes decisions fast to avoid reconsidering them. "Rodrigo can do the cooking." She would have smiled, but she thought it might alarm him. "Rodrigo cannot cook," she said. "I know," he said, and something shifted at the corner of his mouth that was not quite a smile but was the nearest Fletcher Jarvis got to one in her presence, and it felt obscurely like a gift. She left for Denver on Thursday morning. Fletcher loaded her carpet bag onto the stage himself, without comment, and when she was seated and the driver was preparing to move, he stood beside the stage door with his hat in his hands, which she had never seen him do before. "Be careful," he said. It was directed at the carpet bag, or possibly at the air between them. "I will," she said, and the stage lurched into motion, and she turned to look forward and kept her eyes there until Caldera Creek was out of sight. Denver was a city that had grown faster than its manners. In 1882, it had a railroad and several banks, and a newspaper and aspirations toward civilization that were in energetic competition with its foundational instincts. Fiona knew it well enough to navigate it and poorly enough to find it frightening at its edges, and she moved through it with the careful purpose of someone who is aware that they may be noticed by someone they would prefer not to encounter. She did not see Gerald Whitmore or anyone connected to the Whitmore household in the 5 days she was in Denver. She was aware that this could be luck, or it could be that he had ceased to think about her, and she found she could not determine which was more likely. What she found, with the help of the retired land office man Harriet had written to on her behalf, was exactly what she had hoped to find. The original transaction records for the Eastern Tributary land, filed before Fletcher had bought the parcel, showed unambiguously that the water rights had been conveyed as part of a consolidated transfer that explicitly excluded the separate claim Hatch's document purported to establish. The Hatch document, when compared to the original records, appeared to be a selective transcription that omitted 3 key clauses. Whether this was fraud or error was a question for lawyers, but the original records made the claim far less solid than it had appeared. She had a clerk at the land office make certified copies of the relevant documents for a fee of $4. She wrapped them carefully in oilcloth inside her carpetbag and spent the remaining days in Denver finding a lawyer who did not work for Clement Hatch. She found one, a careful, skeptical man named Aldridge Booth, who had moved to Denver from St. Louis 2 years ago, and who read the documents with the focused attention of someone who recognized something worth fighting for. He could not come to Caldera Creek in person on short notice, but he wrote a detailed legal brief interpreting the document's implications, signed and sealed it officially, and told her that if Fletcher Jarvis could get this material in front of the hearing commissioner before the January 7th date, the commission would have a significant evidentiary problem with Hatch's claim. She took the stage back on the morning of the 6th day. She sat with her carpetbag in her lap for 8 hours on bad roads through mountain cold, and she thought about Fletcher kneeling in the mud with his hands on the flank of a dead animal. And she thought about what it meant that she had come to Denver for him without quite deciding to, because the decision had arrived fully formed from somewhere below the level of conscious deliberation. That was the kind of thing she usually examined very carefully and then set aside. She was setting it aside less efficiently than usual. The stage arrived in Caldera Creek after dark. Rodrigo was waiting at the stage stop with a lantern and a horse, and this startled her until she realized that someone had been tracking the schedule. "He sent you," she said. Rodrigo smiled. "He told me to be here in case the stage ran late and the walk was dark," he said, with the precise neutrality of a man conveying a message exactly as it was delivered. "He did not say anything about sending me. He said he happened to think of it." She laughed despite herself, the first genuine laugh she had produced in some days, and Rodrigo's smile widened. He rode beside her back to the ranch, and when they came into the yard the lamp was on in the front room, though she knew Fletcher rose before 4, and it was now well past 9. He appeared in the doorway before she had dismounted, which meant he had heard the horses. He stood in the doorway with the light behind him and said nothing. She descended from the horse and retrieved her carpetbag and walked up the porch steps and held the oilcloth-wrapped documents out to him. "Certified copies from the Denver Territorial Land Office," she said. "A lawyer named Aldridge Booth has written a brief explaining their implications. The hearing is tomorrow." He took the documents. He looked at them. He looked at her. "You found what you were looking for," he said. "Yes." "Both things," he said. She met his eyes. "Both things," she confirmed. He stepped back from the doorway to let her in, and when she passed him, she was close enough to feel the warmth radiating from him in the cold air. And she walked to the kitchen and began to put water on for tea because her hands needed something to do. She heard him at the desk in the front room, going through the documents, and after a moment she heard him say quietly, to himself or possibly to her through the wall between rooms, "Good." Just the one word. And in his voice it sounded like something that had taken an enormous effort to say. She slept soundly for the first time in 6 days. The hearing the following morning was one of those bureaucratic confrontations that have the shape of a mundane legal proceeding and the substance of a much larger contest. Clement Hatch arrived with a lawyer and 2 associates and occupied one side of the county commissioner's office with the practiced confidence of a man accustomed to rooms bending to his presence. He was a large man in an expensive coat, with a face that had been handsome once and now wore its age like a territorial claim, and he looked at Fletcher across the commissioner's desk with the faint, tolerant smile of a man who already knows the outcome. Fiona sat in the back of the room, which was small enough that there was no true back. She was not there in any official capacity. She was there because she had come this far and she intended to see it through. Fletcher stood without counsel, which she had argued against on the stage ride to town that morning, and which he had declined to change in the particular way he declined things he had already decided, which was to say he simply did not respond. But he had the documents, and he knew how to read. He presented the case himself, in the flat, precise way he did everything without elaboration or drama, laying the certified land records against Hatch's filed claim and walking Commissioner Doyle through the specific language discrepancies with a methodical patience that left very little room for counter-argument. Hatch's lawyer raised objections, several of which were technically sophisticated, and Fletcher answered each one by returning to the documents without raising his voice once. Commissioner Doyle was not, Fiona judged, a particularly courageous man. He was a man who was acutely sensitive to which way the wind was blowing, and the wind in that room shifted noticeably halfway through the proceeding when Doyle read Aldridge Booth's brief and asked Hatch's lawyer a question that the lawyer could not satisfactorily answer. The water rights claim was dismissed pending further investigation. Hatch's filed document was referred for independent review, which was the kind of language that meant someone was going to be asked uncomfortable questions about its provenance. None of this was final or permanent, but it was a door slamming in the face of what had appeared to be an inevitable outcome, and the sound of it was very satisfying. Hatch, when the decision was announced, turned his large body toward the room and looked at Fletcher for a moment with an expression that had abandoned tolerance entirely. Then he looked at Fiona, which she had not expected, with the particular look of a man who has identified an unexpected variable in a situation he believed he controlled. "Miss," he said to her, in a tone that made the word into something less than a greeting. She held his gaze without moving. Fletcher turned from Hatch with the careful deliberateness of a man placing the other person's existence outside his consideration, and walked toward the door, and paused beside where she was seated, and said very quietly, "Come on." She stood, and they walked out together into the cold December morning. On the street, Fletcher stopped and looked up at the sky with an expression she had learned to read as processing, the face of a man arranging the interior world before it expressed itself outward. "That bought time," he said. "It should do more than that if the investigation proceeds," she said. "It might." He was quiet for a moment. "You went to Denver for those records?" "Yes. You said you had an errand there." "I did," she said. "I dealt with it." He looked at her then, the direct gray look, and she felt it the way she always did, like a hand placed flat on her sternum. "What kind of errand?" he said. She had thought about how to answer this. She had been thinking about it since Denver. The secret she had been carrying had grown heavier with distance from the thing she was afraid of, and she was tired of its weight, and she realized, tired of being afraid of him knowing her actual history. He was, she had concluded, somewhere between Caldera Creek and Denver and back again, worth the risk of honesty. She told him about Gerald Whitmore. Not quickly, because it was not a quick story when told accurately, and she did not abbreviate the parts that were difficult to say. She told him about the escalating pressure in the Denver household, the advance that had turned frightening, the careful exit, the uncertainty about whether she had been followed. She told him about the reason the phrase "no references from Denver required" had caught her eye in the newspaper advertisement. He listened to all of it without interruption, standing on the boardwalk outside the county commissioner's office in the cold morning, his hat in his hands because he had taken it off at the start of the hearing and had not put it back on yet. And his face was unreadable in the way that she had learned, was not the same as unmoved. When she finished, he was quiet for long enough that she began to catalog possible responses, among which were various versions of dismissal or practical management that would hurt but would be survivable. "Is he going to come looking?" Fletcher said. "I don't believe so. He has more to lose by making a public issue of it than I do." "If he did," Fletcher said very carefully, "he would not get near this ranch." She looked at him. His jaw was set. His eyes were on the middle distance, not quite meeting hers, in the way of a man who has said something more than he intended to and is not going to unsay it. "Fletcher," she said. "The stage is at 2, he said. "You want to get something to eat before we go back?" It was not a question, and it was definitely a subject change. And she let him make it because he had just said something significant enough to require some time to settle. They ate at the small restaurant beside the general store, which served a decent beef stew and cornbread that was not as good as hers, and they sat across from each other at a table by the window and ate mostly in silence, which was their customary mode. But the silence had a different quality now, something inhabited and warm in a way she could not quite name. She had told him her secret. He had not pulled back from it. The stage home was cold and they were the only passengers. She fell asleep somewhere in the first hour and woke to find her head resting against his shoulder, and she felt his breathing, steady and slow, and she did not move and he did not move, and they traveled through the mountain dark like that until the lights of Caldera Creek appeared below them. He did not mention it. She did not mention it. They arrived at the ranch, and Rodrigo made something unrecognizable for dinner, and Cal said what everyone was thinking about the dinner, and Fletcher said something dry that made even Ellie laugh, and Fiona stood at the stove eating her unrecognizable meal, and thought that she was, possibly, in a great deal of trouble. December moved toward Christmas with the particular beauty and harshness of a Colorado mountain winter. The surviving cattle were stable. The investigation into Hatch's document had been taken up, to general surprise, by a territorial attorney general's representative from Denver, who had apparently been collecting complaints about Hatch's land acquisition methods for some time, and found the document comparison useful. Fletcher received the news of this development on a cold Tuesday morning and stood at the kitchen table reading the letter and said nothing for approximately 1 minute. And then he put the letter down and drank his coffee. And then he said, "You sent something to the Attorney General's office." She did not pretend to be surprised by this. "I sent them a copy of what I brought from Denver. They seemed like people who would be interested." He put his cup down. "When did you do that?" he said. "Before I got on the stage, in Denver." Another silence measured in heartbeats. "You planned that from the beginning," he said. "I planned it when I realized Hatch had probably done this before," she said. "Which was when Rodrigo told me about the 4 ranches he'd already absorbed." He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen before, something that was moving toward acknowledgement, toward recognition, towards something that made her want to look away and also made her absolutely unable to. "Why?" he said. Just that. She could have said several things. She said the simplest one. "Because it was wrong what he was doing to you, and I could do something about it." He picked his cup back up. He looked at the table. "I'm raising your wage," he said, in the same tone he used to discuss fence repairs. "Fletcher, starting this month." She almost laughed, almost cried. Did neither. "Thank you," she said. Christmas came, and Fiona made a proper celebration of it with the resources available to her, which were modest but sufficient. She baked a ham and 2 pies, set the table with the good cloth she found in the linen trunk, and decorated the front room with pine boughs she had gathered herself from the edge of the property, because there was no other greenery available, and she refused to let December pass entirely without an effort. Fletcher came in for dinner and stopped in the doorway of the front room with a look of mild bewilderment at the pine boughs. "Did you cut those?" he said. "I did. From the east stand. From the very edge. I left the trees." He walked through the room and sat at the table, and when she brought the food out he said grace with the abrupt, slightly uncomfortable brevity of a man who knows it is required, but has not entirely negotiated his feelings about whether someone is listening. Rodrigo and Illy and Cal were at their own celebration in the bunkhouse, which Fiona had stocked with a proper holiday meal earlier in the day, so it was the 2 of them at the table. The candlelight was warm, and outside the snow was falling in the slow, purposeful way of a proper Colorado snowstorm, and Fiona thought that if she had deliberately designed an evening for maximum emotional danger, she could not have done better. He was on his 2nd glass of cider, which was the closest thing to festivity she had been able to produce, and he was more relaxed than she had seen him, the armor slightly displaced by the combination of warmth and food and the particular vulnerability of a holiday evening. "Did you have family?" she asked carefully. "Growing up?" He was quiet for a moment in the way that might mean he would not answer, and then, "A mother. She died when I was 12. After that it was my father, which was different from having family." "I'm sorry," she said. "About your mother." "It was a long time ago. That doesn't always make it smaller." He looked at her across the table, candlelight moving across his face, and she saw something that was usually completely concealed, a rawness under the surface, the evidence of a history that had required him to build all that armor and to build it very young. "No," he said quietly. "It doesn't." She told him about her own family then, because it felt like an exchange should be offered, and also because she wanted to. Her parents were both living in Ohio, and she had a brother who was 22 and a sister who was 19. And she had come west not because of Gerald Whitmore, though he had accelerated the departure. She had come west because Ohio had felt like a room with walls that were slowly moving inward, and she had always believed there was more sky somewhere if she could get to it. "There's more sky here," he said. "I noticed," she said, "the first morning I was here. I walked out before breakfast and I just stood there for about 10 minutes staring at it." The corner of his mouth moved. "I know," he said. She looked at him. "I saw you from the barn," he said with a directness that startled her. "I thought you were going to walk straight out into it." She felt warm in a way that had nothing to do with the stove. "I considered it," she said. He looked at her a moment longer than he usually allowed himself, and then looked at his plate, and she looked at hers, and the snow came down outside the window in the dark, and neither of them said anything else that was particularly remarkable, but the evening had shifted into something she would carry for a long time. January brought the resolution of several things at once, which was how life in her experience tended to operate, clustering its revelations rather than distributing them at reasonable intervals. The Territorial Attorney General's Office formal investigation into Clement Hatch's land acquisition practices was announced publicly, which sent a visible tremor through the established social order of Larimer County. Hatch was not arrested, and likely would not be. Powerful men in 1882, Colorado operated in a legal atmosphere that was selectively applied. But the investigation meant that his current methods would not be available to him for the time being, and several of his associates in the county government, including someone in the commissioner's office, had received formal inquiries that were apparently unwelcome enough to produce a sudden enthusiasm for procedural correctness. The water rights hearing resulted in a final dismissal of Hatch's claim in mid-January. Fletcher read the official notification in the morning, and put it on the table, and put his coffee cup on top of it, and went out to the barn without a word, which she had learned to read as profound relief expressed in the only available language. She stood at the kitchen window and watched him go and felt a happiness for him that sat somewhere deep in her ribs, settled and warm. And she thought that the particular feeling of being happy on someone else's behalf, when that happiness mattered more to you than your own, was probably worth paying attention to as information about the state of one's heart. Illy Church, who had the social subtlety of a younger sibling and approximately the same appetite for romantic observation, said to her one morning while she was rolling biscuit dough, "Is something different with Fletcher? He seems different." "Different how?" she said without looking up. Less like he might bite you if you asked him something. More like he might actually answer." She kept rolling the dough. "People change," she said, which was not an answer, and Illy accepted it with the cheerful incuriosity of someone who has already moved on to the next thought. Rodrigo, who was not Illy, said nothing directly but had taken to finding reasons to absent himself from the kitchen at moments when Fletcher happened to come in, which Fiona chose not to examine. The thing between her and Fletcher was not a thing in any formal or declared sense, and she was aware that it might never be, because the man conducted his interior life as though it were sensitive government documents, and whatever he felt about her, if he felt anything, was wrapped in 3 layers of leather and stored in a locked box in a room he might not even open for himself. But there were things. The way he found reasons to be in the kitchen in the late evenings, when the hands were long in the bunkhouse, sitting at the table reading or going over the ranch books while she worked. The way he had started telling her things. Small things about the cattle, about the land, about problems he was working through, not asking for input necessarily, but offering the information in a way that she understood meant he wanted her to have it, to be a person who knew his world. The way he watched her when she was talking to Rodrigo or Cal and did not know Fletcher was there, and the expression on his face at those moments was the one she found most unmanageable, because she could not name it except as something intense and unguarded. In early February, she cut her hand on a tin edge while opening a can. It was not serious, but it bled significantly, and she was dealing with it at the kitchen sink when Fletcher came in and saw the blood and crossed the kitchen in 4 strides and took her hand in both of his without asking. She went entirely still. He examined the cut with a focused frown, turned her hand to check the depth, said nothing. He was still holding her hand. She was aware of every point of contact with a hyper-specific physical attention that she found simultaneously pleasant and overwhelming. "It's not deep," he said. "No," she agreed, in a voice that sounded admirably steady given the circumstances. He went to the medical kit on the shelf and came back with bandaging material, and he wrapped her hand with a careful efficiency that spoke of long practice with injuries, and he tied it off with a neat knot and did not release her hand immediately after. He was looking at the bandage. His thumbs moved very slightly against her palm. "Fletcher," she said, He looked up. The distance between them was less than a foot. She was aware of his breathing, aware of her own, aware of the particular quality of the silence that had settled over the kitchen. "I should finish she started. "Fiona," he said. Her name in his voice for the first time, not as a practical address but as the entirety of what he was trying to say. She looked at him. "I don't know how to." He stopped. A muscle worked in his jaw. He was fighting something, she could see it, the particular struggle of a man who has lived so long in isolation from his own emotional life that its expressions have become a foreign language he cannot quite produce. "I don't have the words for it." "For what?" He stopped again. "You don't have to," she said softly. "I want to," he said, and the want in those two words was so uncharacteristically raw that she felt it physically, a pressure behind her sternum. She turned her free hand and covered his, the bandaged one and the unhurt one both, and he went very still. "I know," she said. "Fletcher, I know." He looked at their hands, he looked at her face. Something in him was very close to breaking open in the best possible way. The way a window breaks open in spring, because the pressure of everything growing on the other side of it has finally exceeded the latch. He leaned his forehead down until it rested against hers, very gently. And they stood like that in the kitchen with the stove ticking and the February wind at the eaves, and neither of them moved for a long time. He kissed her at last, careful and certain, and she kissed him back with everything she had been holding since October, and it was, she thought, the most honest thing that had ever happened to her. The declaration having been made, such as it was, in the wordless and fully comprehensible language of two people who have been circling each other for 4 months in a kitchen the size of a large thought, the practical question arose of what it meant. Fletcher Jarvis was not a man who operated in the realm of courtship conventions with any fluency, as she had already established. But he was, once the wall had been breached, a man who was remarkably thorough. He did not say romantic things, but he did things. He built her a proper bookshelf for the small room behind the kitchen, because he had noticed she stacked her books in piles on the floor, and found this apparently unacceptable. He started coming to her room in the evenings, and sitting in the chair by the window while she read or sewed, not requiring conversation, just present, which she found more intimate than conversation would have been. He brought her wildflowers from the creek bank in March when they came up, small and defiant in the snow-edged mud, and presented them with the expression of a man handing over a legal document, and she put them in a tin cup on the windowsill, and they stood there between them like a small treaty. She started waking earlier to ride with him on his boundary patrol, which had been his solitary ritual for 8 years. In late March, Rodrigo asked Fletcher, with the direct pragmatism of a man who had watched the situation develop for several months and felt the timeline was becoming inefficient, what his intentions were. Fletcher's intentions, communicated to Fiona that evening at the kitchen table with the same flat delivery he used to discuss cattle prices, were as follows. He wanted to marry her if she was willing, and she should know that the ranch had a main bedroom that was not currently being used as a main bedroom, and that this represented an inefficiency he was prepared to address. He did not love easily, he said, and he had not intended to love her, and he found the entire experience somewhat difficult to manage because he was not sure he was very good at it. But he was certain, which he said was the only thing he could offer with confidence. "You are very certain," she agreed. "I am," he said. "About this." She took his face in both her hands, which made him go absolutely still in the way that her touch always did, as though he were receiving something he did not yet know how to normalize. "Fletcher Jarvis," she said, "you are about the least conventional man I have ever encountered in my life, and you have built something extraordinary with your own hands, and you loved dead cattle in a rainstorm with more grief than most people show for anything, and you are the most honest person I know. And yes." He blinked. "Yes," she said again. His arms came around her with the tentative care of someone handling something he is terrified to break, and then with less tentativeness, and she laughed against his shoulder. And after a moment, she felt him laughing too, quietly, more of a vibration than a sound, as though he were practicing it for the first time and finding it more comfortable than expected. They were married in May of 1883 by the Caldera Creek minister, in a ceremony that was brief and sincere, and attended by Rodrigo and Illy and Cal and Harriet Combs, and about 40 other people from the valley, who had collectively decided to treat it as a community event, because the valley did not have many pleasant occasions, and intended to make the most of this one. They spoke the vows in the plain manner of the time and place, and when the minister said the thing about kissing the bride, Fletcher did it with more decisiveness than ceremony, which drew laughter from the assembled congregation and a satisfied nod from Rodrigo. The summer of 1883 was better than the previous year. The rain came in reasonable amounts at reasonable times, which in the cattle country of Colorado felt like a personal favor from the universe. The surviving herd recovered and grew. The investigation into Clement Hatch concluded in the autumn with a settlement that restricted several of his land acquisition practices, and required him to return one of the 4 ranches he had obtained under legally questionable circumstances. He did not return Fletcher's attention or pursue the water rights matter further, and he eventually sold a significant portion of his Larimer County holdings and redirected his interests north, which the valley registered with collective relief. Fiona reorganized the ranch house with the calm authority of a woman who has taken something that was functional and made it livable, and Fletcher let her do it with minimal resistance, which she recognized as a significant concession from a man who had organized his environment into a working extension of his own defensive structure. She added curtains. She added a proper garden in the south side of the yard where she grew vegetables with the devoted attention of a woman who has decided that the ground is hers now, and she intends to make something from it. She wrote to her parents in Ohio and her brother and her sister, and she told them about the ranch and the mountains and the man she had married. And in her mother's response, she found a warmth and relief that told her the distance had been a source of worry, and that the news of her establishment was received as an answer to a long prayer. Rodrigo, who turned out to be an excellent and enthusiastic cook when properly motivated, took over the ranch kitchen on most weekdays once Fiona had the garden and the household entirely in hand, and she and Fletcher had long mornings on the boundary rides and long evenings at the kitchen table, and the ranch hummed along around them with the particular satisfying hum of a place that is being cared for by people who love it. She was going to tell him in August, but she waited until she was certain, and she told him in September, on the porch in the evening after supper while the sun was going down behind the western ridgeline in shades of orange and copper that painted the whole valley in improbable color. She told him she was expecting a child. He sat very still for a moment. Then he turned from the sunset to look at her, and his face was doing something she had not seen before, a complex, layered undoing of composure, everything softening at once, and she felt his hand close over hers on the porch railing. "Fiona," he said. "In the spring," she said. He brought her hand to his mouth and pressed his lips to her knuckles, a gesture that was so unlike his usual register of expression that it surprised a sound from her that was somewhere between a laugh and a sob, and he made a sound in response that was in the same category. They sat on the porch together until the light was gone and the stars were out in the enormous Colorado sky, her leaning against his shoulder and his arm around her. And the mountains stood around the valley in the dark, like they had always stood, indifferent and magnificent. And neither of them needed to say anything because everything had already been said. The winter of 1883 into 1884 was easier than the winter before had been. The way things often become easier once you have the right person beside you, and the structural threats have been addressed. Fletcher worked with his customary relentless commitment, but Fiona had introduced, over the previous year, a concept of finishing that he was gradually accepting, which was to say that the work ended at a specific hour in the evening, and the evening then existed for other purposes. He had adopted this principle with the slightly bewildered air of a man who has been told about a territory he did not know was adjacent to his own, and is not yet sure of its customs, but finds them interesting. They argued occasionally in the winter months, as people who live in close quarters and have strong opinions must. These arguments had the character of their respective personalities. Fiona's direct and emotionally articulate, Fletcher's compact and stubborn and occasionally circuitous in the way of a man who is not sure how to fight in this particular language. They argued about the best approach to the northern fence repair, and about whether to take on a fourth ranch hand, and about one incident involving a neighbor's stray cattle on the east pasture that became more heated than the actual subject warranted. Ellie Church fell in love in the early spring of 1884 with a young woman named Martha Daines from the neighboring valley, and this took up a significant portion of the bunkhouse conversation through March and April. Cal offered extensive and largely unqualified romantic wisdom. Rodrigo listened with the patient amusement of a man who has seen several rodeos. Fletcher, when Ellie came to him with the slightly frantic energy of a young man who has just recognized that the world contains another person he cannot manage without, said, "Tell her," with the brevity of a man who had learned the value of directness the long way around. Ellie told her. Martha Daines said yes, with the direct confidence of a woman who had been waiting for him to notice. The bunkhouse celebrated in a manner that kept everyone up past 10, which Cal said was the latest he had been up in a decade. Fiona's son was born in late April of 1884. He arrived in the particular way of all births in that time and place, which was to say with considerable drama and the assistance of the county midwife. A competent and unflappable woman named Doris Hale, who had delivered enough babies in Larimer County to have developed a professional equanimity about most eventualities. Fletcher was in the house the entire time, which Doris said was unusual and which the hands, waiting in the yard despite having no functional role to play there, considered absolutely appropriate. The boy was healthy and loud and had a considerable opinion about having been born, which he expressed at length. Fiona held him in the first minutes with the overwhelming, total, slightly terrifying love that arrives with a first child, the love that rewrites the architecture of the self. Fletcher sat on the edge of the bed, which he had been guided to by Doris with the firm efficiency of a woman managing a very large and slightly uncertain instrument, and he looked at his son with an expression that Fiona, even in the midst of her own exhaustion and wonder, was paying attention to. He put out one large, work-hardened hand and touched the boy's face with a finger, very gently, the way you touch something you are frightened might vanish if you're not careful. "Hello," he said, very quietly. Fiona watched her husband say hello to his son, and felt something so complete and settled in her chest that she thought that if a person was permitted a handful of perfect moments in a lifetime, this was one of hers. They named him James. James William Jarvis, for no man in either of their histories in particular, because Fletcher said they didn't owe the name to anyone and she agreed. James was not a quiet infant. He had opinions and a lung capacity that impressed Doris and exhausted both his parents in the first months with a cheerful thoroughness. Fletcher, who had organized the world around the concept of self-sufficiency, discovered that an infant is constitutionally opposed to this principle, and he navigated this discovery with the grim determination of a man who has encountered difficult terrain and decided to cross it anyway. Fiona, watching from the doorway on these evenings, thought that she had used up her word count of humor on that image, and still found it more beautiful than she could adequately explain. The year 1884 moved on around the ranch with the seasonal rhythms of a working cattle operation, the spring calving and the summer grazing and the autumn gather and the winter preparation. And the Jarvis Ranch occupied its place in the valley with a stability and productivity that had survived drought and legal attack and disease, and come through to the other side of all of it. Harriet Combs at the general store said to Fiona one October afternoon, "You know what people say about your husband." "What do they say?" Fiona said, examining bolts of winter fabric. "That Fletcher Jarvis married up so far it ought to require an altitude permit." Fiona laughed. "Fletcher would say that's inefficient talk." "What do you say?" Harriet asked. Fiona thought about October of 1882, and a stagecoach and a carpetbag, and an advertisement with a phrase she had not been able to set down. She thought about a cold porch and a blue dress, and the way a man who has never learned to say what he feels says it anyway in the language of presence and work, and the particular quality of his attention. She thought about a December dawn when she had stood in a yard in Colorado and looked at more sky than she had ever seen, and a man in a barn doorway who had watched her and not said anything for a full year afterward. "I think," she said, "that I got exactly what I came looking for, and I didn't know that was what I was looking for until I found it." Harriet nodded with the satisfaction of a woman whose romantic interventions have been successful even when they were not technically interventions. The autumn of that year brought a letter from the Attorney General's office in Denver notifying Fletcher that the full resolution of the Hatch investigation had resulted in the formal cancellation of all disputed claims against the Jarvis Eastern tributary water rights in perpetuity, recorded in the county land office as a permanent instrument, which was the legal equivalent of the matter being settled so thoroughly that it could not be reopened. Fletcher read the letter at the breakfast table on a Tuesday morning in October, while James sat in the wooden high chair that Rodrigo had built over the summer, conducting experiments with oatmeal. He read it twice, set it down, picked up his coffee. "Done," he said. She looked across the table at him. "Done," she agreed. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, and James, interpreting this movement as having something to do with the oatmeal, made an interrogative sound that caused both his parents to look at him. He was 11 months old and had begun to communicate with the confident authority of someone who knows they have an audience and intends to use it. "His father's gray eyes in a rounder face," Harriet said. "His mother's expression," Rodrigo said, which was the look of someone who has already worked out what needs to happen and is preparing to make it so. The winter of 1884 was quiet and good. The snow came early and came properly, which the cattlemen of Larimer County received as good news because it meant a wet spring and full creeks, and the kind of grazing season that built herds. James took his first steps in the front room on a December morning, between the table leg and his mother's waiting hands, and fell directly onto his padded rear end, and regarded this outcome with brief consideration, before pulling himself upright on the table leg and attempting it again. Fletcher watched this from the doorway, just inside from the cold, still in his coat and hat from the morning barn work, and the expression on his face was the one she had been carrying for 2 years, the particular unguarded expression, the one that lived below the armor and only surfaced for the things that were real. Cal Duffer retired from ranch work in the new year of 1885, having decided at 58 that he had told enough stories about other men's livestock, and intended to spend his remaining working years in a slightly less vertical county. He left with a handshake from Fletcher, a long and enthusiastic farewell from Ellie, and a package of food from Fiona that was enough to see him to the next territory, which he received with the specific gruffness of an older man who is moved and cannot say so. Ellie Church, now established in his courtship of Martha Danes with the same earnest persistence he brought to all his efforts, asked Fletcher in the spring of 1885 for a small piece of advice about the practicalities of proposing marriage, and Fletcher said, with the deadpan certainty of a man operating from first-hand knowledge, "Don't think too long about it. The longer you think, the worse the thinking." Ellie proposed that weekend. Martha said yes before he finished the question. The spring of 1885 was everything the snow had promised. The creek ran full through the Jarvis land. The cattle calved in good numbers, and Fiona's garden came up early with the particular enthusiasm of ground that has been properly tended for 2 seasons. She was in the garden in the late April morning, James sitting in the dirt nearby engaged in geological research, when she became aware that the future was arranged exactly as she had not planned it, but had, she thought, done fairly well at building out of what was available. She was also, as she had suspected for several weeks and confirmed to herself that morning, carrying their second child, which she told Fletcher that evening with the same porch at sunset method she had used the first time because it had worked well. He received this news with rather more preparation than the first time, which was to say he did not go entirely still, but rather turned and looked at her with an immediacy that had no composure in it at all, which was, she had concluded long ago, her favorite version of him. The version that existed in the spaces between the armor, fully present and entirely his own. "Again," he said. "Again," she confirmed. He laughed genuinely and fully, a sound that had become less rare over the past 2 years, but still carried the particular pleasure of something precious, because it was not common currency. He pulled her into his arms with the ease of long practice, and she went there with the ease of a woman who knows where she belongs. And James, who had tottered over to investigate, grabbed his father's boot and said something urgent in the private language of 1-year-olds. She had not mentioned it because it was his, the one moment he had ever given in completely, entirely privately, to the grief of love and loss, the one time the armor had failed entirely, and she had been there to see it, and she had turned away and pretended she had not, because she understood even then, before she knew anything else about him, that some things belong entirely to the person experiencing them, and the only gift you can give is to protect the privacy of it. She had loved him more for it from that moment, not in spite of the tears, but because of them. Because a man who weeps in private for dead cattle in the rain loves the things in his care with an absolute wholeness that cannot be performed. And a man who does not ask anyone to see his grief is a man who is giving you, by letting you see it even by accident, something irreplaceable. She had kept it for him all this time, wrapped up safe, the way you keep a person's deepest thing safe, because it was his, and because love is, in the end, not the declaration but the keeping. The second child was a daughter. She arrived in November of 1885, smaller than James had been and considerably more opinionated, with a dark-haired vitality that had everyone in the household reorganized around her preferences within 24 hours. They named her Clara, for no particular reason except that when Fiona said the name it sounded right, And Fletcher, sitting with his daughter in the big chair by the front room window on her second day of life, said it quietly to himself, and then said it was a good name, which from Fletcher Jarvis was an endorsement of considerable force. James, at nearly 2, received his sister with the comprehensive suspicion of a firstborn child confronted with unsolicited competition. And then, gradually over the following weeks, with a protective fascination that had Rodrigo shaking his head with something that looked very much like emotional undoing. The ranch in those years after 1885 was a living thing, breathing with seasons and growing with deliberate care. Fletcher extended the grazing land on the south side with a careful land purchase from a retiring neighbor, adding to the Jarvis holdings in a manner that would have satisfied his younger self, and did satisfy his current one. He hired 2 additional ranch hands, younger men, and managed them with the combination of exacting standards and underlying fairness that Rodrigo had apparently been describing to people in town for years, as the reason the Jarvis hands stayed. Fiona taught school on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons in town for 2 years, because the valley needed a schoolteacher, and she had been educated thoroughly in Ohio, and there was a gap where the last teacher had been, and she was not the kind of person to see a gap and do nothing about it. Fletcher drove her in on those days and collected her, and on the days he could not, Rodrigo did, and this arrangement was offered without discussion and without requirement that she ask for it, which was Fletcher's version of "I support everything you do." She stopped teaching when the schoolteacher's position was filled properly by a young man fresh from a teaching certificate in Colorado Springs, and she returned her 2 afternoons a week to the ranch, and the garden and the children, and the enormous project of being married to Fletcher Jarvis, which she had long since concluded was the most interesting work she had ever undertaken. In the spring of 1887, she found him in the east pasture. She had walked out there for no particular reason in the late afternoon, following a path that had become habitual, down through the yard and past the barn and along the fence line that had been rebuilt twice since the autumn of 1882, and was now solid and straight and well maintained. The pasture was green in the way that Colorado pasture in April is green, the particular violent abundance of high-altitude spring, and the cattle that grazed here now were healthy and fat, and moved through the grass with the calm authority of animals that are well kept. He was standing at the far fence line, looking out over the land, his hat in his hands. She came up beside him and stood there and looked at what he was looking at, which was the valley laid out below the ridge, the creek glittering, the far ridgeline still snow-capped, the spring sky above it, all in the particular impossible blue that she had stood in the yard and stared at on her first morning at this ranch, 4.5 years ago. "Remember the roan," he said after a moment. She did not pretend she did not know what he meant. "Yes," she said. He was quiet. She stood beside him in the grass and waited, because she had learned his silences as completely as she had ever learned a language, and this one had something in it that was working toward an expression. "3 of her calves in this pasture right now," he said. She looked at the cattle. "Which ones?" He pointed them out. 3 of the younger animals, solid and healthy, carrying something of the genetic argument he had lost in the rain that night and won differently in the years after. "She was a good animal," Fiona said. "She was the best I had at the time." He was quiet again for a moment. "Things come back around if you stay." She looked at his profile, the familiar strong line of it against the late afternoon sky. "Yes," she said, "they do." He put his hat back on and turned from the fence and looked at her with the direct gray look that had never lost its power to arrest her completely. The look that had no performance in it and never had. "You staying?" he said, and it was a joke, barely the kind of joke that rests on the absolute certainty that the answer is not in question. A Fletcher Jarvis joke, dry and affectionate and slightly terrified underneath. She took his arm. "Where would I go?" she said. "The sky's bigger here." The Jarvis Ranch stood for a long time in that valley. The people who knew Fletcher said he became, in the years after 1882, a man who was recognizably himself, but expanded somehow, the way land expands when you irrigate it properly, capable of more and richer things than the dry version of itself. He was not an easy man in the sense of being smooth or light or quick to the warmth that comes easily to some. He was easy in the way of things that are what they are without apology, honest in the particular satisfying way of ground that does not pretend to be anything other than ground. Fiona, who was asked at various points by various people what her secret was, since her husband was famously difficult, and she appeared to have navigated him successfully, always said the same thing, that she had no secret and had never required one, because the man was not difficult. He was just precise about what he let matter. And once you were one of the things that mattered to Fletcher Jarvis, you understood what that meant and why it was worth the patience. She had kept his one moment of grief, the solitary private tears of a hard man in the rain, in the safest place she had. The kind with a man who loved dead cattle in the rain, and chose to love her with the same wholeness, and had no idea how to say any of it but said it anyway, in every other possible way, every single day, for the rest of the long and lucky years they had.